So, good morning. Let's see here. So, lots has gone on this week, and so let's just kind of start by naming a few things. Many of you will know that someone from our own community lost a husband, and two little girls lost a father, and many friends lost a friend in the death of Buzz Walton. And so this week has been a little wild, obviously grief-stricken. It's also been strangely affirming. If I say one more time, I'm going to fire myself. Strangely affirming in the sense that, like, watching community and the way done well, it works. They were a part of this community that they called themselves the Village, which sounds a little bit like a cult, but it's still kind of fun. I'm just kidding. It's awesome. Sorry, that came from nowhere. I don't know why I said that. It's awesome. But like Lori slept at the house for a few days. And for me, it was this reminder that, like, so many of the things we give our time to, they don't actually love us or care about us. Like, when life gets real, the Denver Broncos, they don't care about me or you. Our screens, they can't look after us in times of suffering. And so this thing that we've kind of been working on now since, I guess, early August, of just understanding what does it mean to be the church and what kind of church do we want to be and how do we understand ourselves was for me, as I was experiencing this and watching this, to be honest with you, there was just all kinds of affirmation of this process. I feel like God's Spirit has been leading us through as we've just recognized, like, wait a minute, a bunch of people who don't know each other doesn't really move the needle, and that's not to be confused with our not wanting this to be a safe place for you to be a stranger. We totally want this to be a safe place to hide, but at the same time, what we watched was community in its best possible expression take root. And even for me was this reminder of, it's not if you will suffer, it's not if I will suffer, it's when. And really the only question that you have any control over is who is going to be with you in those seasons. And there's a way of going through those seasons with a kind of superficial community that shows up because they work with you or shows up because they know your name. And then there's a way of going through that because it turns out you just had dinner the night before and now you're meeting under these terms. It was also affirming to me just in the whole way we think about gathering and scattering. And listen, I couldn't be more proud of the things like the Special Olympics and the myriad things that we do, but yesterday might have been our best scattering event ever because a bunch of you who, you didn't know Buzz and you don't know Leslie personally, you were greeting and you were ushering and you were setting up and you were tearing down. And even the fact that the staff just had the emotional space to be present in the ways that we have, for me, just affirms this thing that we're trying to do and this God we're trying to follow. So that all kind of flows into this morning as well. I've known since Sunday afternoon that Saturday was going to be a unique thing in my world, and preparing, having something to say that didn't reek of platitudes and superficiality, and at the same time had some semblance of hope. And so what I've done is we've added a week to this series because we had to begin thinking in terms of yesterday, and I think that's actually a good thing. So what we're going to do this morning is kind of deviate a little bit from Philippians, but we're going to stay in the pain conversation. So if you're with us last week, we started just by asking this question of, ironically, like how do you process pain? And how are you staying present in the midst of pain? Because what's true physically is also true emotionally and spiritually, that if we don't have a strategy, we just withdraw and we seize up and we stop. And so this morning what we're going to do is continue to ask that question, like how do you process pain? But the way we started last week was we started talking about this story that's a couple thousand years old where a guy named Paul found himself in jail, and he was in jail in Rome. We're all but certain he was in jail in Rome, and if that's true, then that means he never got out of that jail, which means he had all kinds of prayers that were unanswered, which we're going to deal with the weekend before Thanksgiving. He eventually died there. But he's writing this letter because these people in a city called Philippi, a little church not unlike this one perhaps, they had responded to his invitation to follow Jesus. In fact, Philippians opens this way. And one of the great ironies of the book of Philippians is it's a book all about people suffering, and it's the most, in my opinion, it might be the most positive letter in the entire Bible. I thank my God every time I remember you. In all my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. So notice in Paul's understanding, like the moment you get it, you give it. Like to follow Christ for Paul meant you start serving people, and that's what he means by partnership. Being confident of this, and this is so appropriate in seasons of suffering, being confident of what? That he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. Translation, tragic loss doesn't mean God left your story, but there's work to be done. And so Paul is writing this letter to these people in Philippi who are themselves suffering, but the reason he's writing the letter is because there's a third party who they've kind of helped themselves into the conversation. And what the third party is doing is they're saying to the Philippians, they're in Philippi, and what they're saying to the Philippians is, how could you possibly believe that Paul is God's guy? He's in jail. How could you possibly believe you're following God? You're suffering. And in doing what they do is expose themselves to the most, to the most old school formula ever. Because what they're exposing is that they have this formula that is your life plus God equals success, happiness, I can't spell, so don't judge me, wealth, and health, and big hair and gold rings. And part of what Paul is going to do in this letter, and this is where we're going to deviate this morning, what Paul is ultimately, in my opinion, doing in this story is he's exposing his own formula. That your life plus God equals something. And that's what we're supposed to talk about this weekend, but now we're not. So you have to come back next week to talk about this. Remember, part of what we drew out last week was that seasons like this remind us that in our lives, we have circumstances. If we could just represent that in the form of a box. Like we have circumstances, and then we have God. And when we're going to Bible school and we're 16 years old and we're reading the Philippians and everything's going well, this all makes sense. And then someone dies an untimely death, and then we don't get the degree, and our wife cheats on us, whatever happens, life happens, and suddenly we're left with a conundrum because that formula, it doesn't work. And there's lots of things we can do there. One of the most common things we can do there is we can just remove God from the equation. Like if we acknowledge that suffering is a problem that we can't solve, an outcome we can't control, then one solution that we have available to us is we just remove God. But I think Dallas Willard's very astute when he says, if we're being honest, we haven't actually solved the problem. Now, if we leave God in there, the problem's not solved either, to be fair. But if we remove God on the grounds of suffering, we've not actually solved the problem. In fact, all we've done is make the 6-year-old in Africa's life meaningless. We still have a problem with or without God. The other thing we can do is we can just get angry. Dallas Willard says there's almost no problem that you can solve with anger that isn't better solved without it. The danger of anger is it gives us the perception that we've solved the problem. And one of the things that Paul does, and this is where we're going to deviate from the letter to the Philippians to Paul's greater work, is in a letter to the Romans, Paul does something that may be helpful to you, though I also get that it doesn't perfectly solve the problem. Paul uses the word sin to speak to this tension. Now, I understand that's an incredibly offensive word because it's been misrepresented by guys on boxes on street corners far too often. But Paul's understanding of sin is quite unlike, I think, that what we've typically, the way we talk about sin. Because if I were to ask you what is sin, probably what would come out of your mouth is some version of it's a violation of a moral code. Problem is in our multicultural culture, we don't even know if we can agree on the moral code. It's a violation of some kind of religious code. Problem is in our multicultural world, we don't even know if we can agree on a religious code. Good news is the text doesn't actually flow in this direction. The text says that sin is a vocational issue. Genesis opens with a God who made you for a purpose, to serve people, his planet, in a specific way. Which means some people serve God by leading churches, and some serve God by drawing blood, and others by selling insurance, and others by teaching school, and others by selling real estate. And therefore, sin in this scope, and I can point you to greater resources if you want to explore this, sin is actually like lying isn't some arbitrary thing that you're not supposed to do, and because God said it, you can't do it. Lying actually, what it does is it compromises your ability to be an image bearer of God. Not because you've lied, but because God loves people, and he's self-giving love, and when you lie, you're actually putting yourself before them. So there's this vocational thing. But Paul actually does something else in this letter to the Romans. In the book of Philippians, Paul never uses the word sin. So if that's a trigger for you, just hang out in Philippians for a while. But in the letter to the Romans, he uses the word sin 74 times. And the bulk of them don't speak to vocational sin or even moral or religious sin. The bulk of them capitalize sin. I don't know if that looks like an S. It's sin, capital S. Listen to the way Paul handles it in Romans. I'm sorry, I still don't know what to do with my Bible. I'm suddenly uncomfortable marching around with the Bible in my hand, but I don't know what I'm supposed to do with it in the interim. Paul says this, what do we say? What shall we conclude? Do we have any advantage? No, not at all. What Paul has just made an argument of is Jewish people, they're broken, they're affected by sin. Non-Jewish people, they're broken. And then he says this, For we have already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are all under the power of sin. And this is representative of a whole scope in Romans where sin isn't a moral violation. Sin is more like a person, or better said, a force. Like think Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker. That sin is like a disease that impacts all of us in the church, outside of the church, with God, without God. Sin is this force that hates, which means if you go like, this sounds a little bit like the Asian yin and yang, or a little bit like Star Wars, like Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader, you're actually not that far off of the biblical narrative. The narrative is that this God, who is all good, creates things, and somehow there's evil. Now, the text never tells us where God comes from or where evil comes from, only that they exist and that they are opposed to one another. And where Paul takes this then is to the cross. See, the cross, its importance to Paul, and more so the resurrection, is that the greatest expression of sin, this force, is death. You could think of it this way. That coach's best play is death. And what happened on the cross, according to Paul, what happened with the resurrection was that 11 guys lined up on opposite sides of the line. And sin ran its best play. Evil, suffering ran its best play. It was death. And for a moment, it looked like it won. And when 3 days later, Jesus walked out of the tomb alive, that was the epic comeback story. It's why Andy Stanley, I think, is doing some of the most important work anybody's done in my lifetime, in recent memory for sure, because what he's saying is Christianity is not based upon the Bible, it's based upon the resurrection. That the Bible came way after that, but the resurrection, because nobody was standing outside the tomb going 10, 9, 8. They'd all gone back to work. So we value Jesus' teaching, but only after the resurrection. Why? Because with the resurrection, death lost. The first fruit, Paul says, of what's to come for the rest. So there's a variable, but then there's this thing that Paul is doing, and this is what I want to kind of bring to the surface. There's this device that I think was a cultural device that Paul would have known well because of the culture he was from, and I can't prove it, but I have the microphone, so I'm just going to say that it's true. And it's something that I think was oh so familiar to him, but not to us, and it's the difference in I think, how we grieve. Now think of it this way. How many of you, raise your hand if you can remember a day where you lived in a house without Wi-Fi? So go ahead. Okay, so look around. Like, yeah, that's all of us. I mean, I think back and I go, man, in the first years of our marriage, we didn't have Wi-Fi. The neighbor did, so I didn't need Wi-Fi. How many of you can remember a day when you lived in a house without indoor plumbing? 1, 2. Is there anybody up there? There were 2 in the last gathering. 3. Do you get the sense that 50 years from now, the Wi-Fi question will come across the same way? And I was thinking to myself, I think if I went home and said to my kids, like, okay, we got to get rid of one of these, I don't even think there'd be a conversation. It'd be like, Dad, dig the hole. Like, we're fine. Like, That Wi-Fi, though, is non-negotiable. My point is simply this. I think lament, and we're going to talk about what that is, I think lament was to Paul's culture what Wi-Fi is to ours. It was just this culturally normal thing that he would have leaned into in the midst of his suffering. Because here was my fear as I analyzed last week. The fear is that if we just take last week and run with it, that the response to suffering is that you stuff it and you put on your big boy pants and you just go out there and do the right thing anyway. I actually don't think that would be in any way emotionally healthy, nor do I think that it's what Paul did. I think he lamented. So let's talk about lament. One place to talk about the lament, or what it looks like, is the cross. Because there's a silence that comes with the cross. You may have noticed that there's a silence that comes with suffering. You know, Jesus changed the world with his words. Something about his resurrection caused us to relook at his words, and rightly so, because his words have helped us reimagine what it means to be human. But at the cross, the chatterbox, who was constantly asking questions and constantly teaching and constantly telling stories, if you compile the narratives, it would look like the cross was about a 6-hour event for Jesus. And if you compile the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Jesus, he spoke 7 sentences in 6 hours. I mean, I think the greatest introvert in the world does more than that. And the question becomes, why was the cross so silent? And the answer from those who suffer is because that's part of what suffering does. It just brings silence. I was talking this week to a friend who I knew way back in Billings, and I knew that his father passed when he was 10 years old. And I was just asking him about that this week, and he said, you know, Adam, the worst part were all these well-intentioned people who would constantly come up to me and give me advice. And the best part, he said, were people who would just look at me and say, so how's it going? Why? Because suffering has a way of making words nonsensical and altogether unhelpful. And there's something affirming about the fact that even Christ on the cross had nothing to say. Why? Well, because in one sense, what Paul says is that Jesus on the cross was taking the very best sin had to offer. Colossians 2 says it this way. Go ahead to that slide, will you? He says, and having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them. So if it's true that all evil was present in that moment, then that was a heavy, suffering-laden moment. There's silence. C.S. Lewis, you may be familiar with his story, but C.S. Lewis, I think he was in his 50s when he married for the first time, the only time. He married an American woman. He was this British theologian who wrote things like the Chronicles of Narnia, and some would say the most important theological thinker of the 20th century. Within just a couple years of his being married to this woman, she was diagnosed with cancer, and before their 4th anniversary, she died. There's some injustice about someone who experiences that in light of his story. And so he turned to writing. That's what he does, is he writes, or what he did. And as I'm told, he filled 4 journals. And after the dust settled and the grief had been worked through enough to kind of bring his eyes up a little bit, he realized, wait a minute, this might be a tool that other people can use. And so under a pseudonym, he published a book called The Grief Observed, which is really just his journals. And by the way, if you're in this season, I don't know of a better book. And one of the things he talks about in there is that at one point he's reflecting on those moments when his house has been full of people and there's all kinds of chatter going on, and he realizes he's getting a little self-conscious because what he's fearing is that people are going to interpret his silence as his asking them to please go. And he says something like, I hope that they can understand that I want their presence, but I don't want to say anything. Silence. Jewish people call it sitting Shiva. When someone passes, your friends and family, they show up at your house in modern culture with a shortened stool, and they just park on the ground for a week. And it's not about what they offer. It's not about what they bring, other than they bring their presence. There's a silence to suffering. And the worst thing we can possibly do is be afraid of it and fill it. And one of the things that Jesus eventually does is he, in his own timing, he breaks it. In Mark's gospel, fittingly a gospel targeted towards people suffering, Mark has Jesus uttering one sentence, and that sentence is what? My God, well, it's Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? Which is probably far too gentle. It was probably more like, my God, where the hell are you? What is going on here? How does this make any sense to you? And yet there's something affirming, isn't there? That God himself could utter those kinds of words, ask those kinds of questions, say those kinds of things. But the thing is, those words aren't an anomaly. They're a lament. They're a practice, a device, a discipline that their culture owned. Laments at their very core are gritty. They're honest. They're unsanitized. They don't sound very good in Western evangelicalism. They don't fit very well on coffee mugs. They're probably not things you'd want to be quoted as having said. What a lament does is it calls God out as someone who has wronged you. A lament says to God, you could have prevented this, and you didn't. A lament says, I'm a victim of an injustice, and I don't like it, and the formulas don't make sense, and I'm going to tell you that. Listen, here's one lament is in Psalm 13, and I think one very important thing to remember about this psalm and any psalm of lament is we're not getting the chronological process. In other words, what's said in 6 verses may have taken 6 months or 6 years. It's the summary of the process. Watch this, Psalm 13. How long, Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? This next line, I think, must have been gritty. Look on me and answer. You must hear yourself saying to someone, look at me. Look at me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes or I'll sleep in death, and my enemy will say, I've overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. It's gritty, it's honest, it's imperfect, it's not very Christian, except for that it is because it is. But you know what I mean? It's not very cultural. It doesn't make very good Christmas card fodder. And yet it's this tool. And what purpose does it serve? Well, part of what a lament does is a lament, it values being among the givers in the world, not the takers, the grateful, not the embittered. And what a lament is doing is saying, I have some academic understanding that if I will say to God what I'm honestly feeling, I will get through the anger, not understand it, not solve it, but I'll get through it so that on the other side, I can return to being a person of gratitude and surrender. That I can once again recall the good moments that we had, the gift that was the relationship that was once there. Because lament owns, on the one hand, that by definition, suffering is inevitable. And the degree to which we suffer is directly proportionate to the degree to which we relationally invest. And so the best strategy for avoiding suffering is to move into a hole. But to live life with people is to sign the check on some moments of horrendous grief. And so lament is trying to own those things intellectually and work through them emotionally in order to get to the other side and once again go, man, it might have only been 17 years, but thank you, God. Listen to the way it resolves. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I'll sing the Lord's praise, for he has done good to me. Notice that all the questions above are still unanswered. The problems are still just hanging out there with an equal sign and no solution. What's been replaced with the need for an answer is gratitude, surrender, submission. Have you ever tried to hate somebody that you were going to go have coffee with? Or I was listening on Being. I don't know if you listen to that podcast stream. There's a brilliant new podcast interview on there where I think, so the guy is from Texas. He's an evangelical. The woman is a lesbian from Brooklyn. And they come together. They're both political commentators on opposite sides of that spectrum. And Kristen Tippett brings them together in Missoula, actually. And she has this conversation about agreeing to disagree in civil discourse. And the guy actually says in the interview, he said, when I told my friends I was going to go to this interview, they told me not to because they said, if you meet her, you'll like her. You know how we can create these grand narratives of hate in our head? And what's the most important way to make sure that the narrative stays intact? That there's no actual relational contact. Right? Because you can hate your boss, and then you sit down in front of her, and suddenly you don't hate like you used to. AA has a statement that is something like, if you hate somebody, then pray for the bastard, and 40 days later, you'll be better. And the idea is 40 days later, you won't think of them as a bastard. Why? Because you're relationally engaged. Jesus says, notice, love your enemies, pray for them. Why? Because it's really hard to hate somebody. But if you're just left to your own devices, I mean, you can put the days of our lives to shame with the narratives that you can weave about all the reasons why you are justified in your hatred. A lament takes us back to this place where it recognizes that there will be seasons of life where our most natural response to God will be doubt at best and hatred very likely. But what lament says is, okay, but if I go to coffee with him, then that'll be hard to live in that space. And we can get through this space. And I wonder if part of the way we have to understand the background of Philippians is that Paul was not some robot of a man who just wrote a letter and said, I'll tell you what you need to do is you just need to go be Jesus no matter what's going on around you, which is true, but it's more true after a long process of lament. And the assumption that I'm operating on is that Paul had some what the hell moments while he was sitting in jail. And what we're getting is the fruit, the gratitude that happens on the other side of lament. Some of you have the luxury of this being academic. I would be among you. And my hope is that you just store this idea in your heart, knowing that the next time or the first time you face suffering on the level that someone like Leslie is currently facing it, you have some places to turn to. And others of you are in the midst of it, whether it be death or a marriage that's nothing like what you signed up for, whether it be some kind of illness or a vocational challenge or a test that you don't think you passed. It doesn't matter. God's permission is, I don't need your Christian sanitized language. I need you. I was talking to a friend this week, and I've had this conversation a couple times in the last couple of weeks where someone was concerned that someone they loved hated God. And I was like, yeah, but you have nothing to worry about, because the good news is they're telling God they hate him. Which would you rather, a son or a daughter who hated your guts and didn't even bother with relationship? Or one who just persistently told you that? Laments are about people who are telling God that, because we value being a different kind of person and we know we've got work to do. I'd like to pray. God, I'm grateful that for you suffering wasn't academic, that ours is not a Herculean God who doesn't know what it's like to be human and face things like death. God, I'm grateful for the incarnation, and beyond the intellectual hoity-toityness of it, the reminder that we can say what we want about suffering, but you've subjected yourself to it. God, some of us are developing tools for future moments that we dread, and others of us are trying to find the next step in the season that we're in right now, and we just pray that your Holy Spirit would guide us. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.